We shall look at the analysis for the text little magazines in the new space for literary writing by Anjali Narlekar. Now, this is a book that explores the rise of the Bombay poets of the 1960s and their relevance in the current literary format and literary work today. Right? Now, the book, of course, specifically, we will be focusing on the origin of the Little magazine and its significance in contributing to both Dalit literature, resistance writing, feminist discourses and writings, and how it becomes a mold for further such challenges and protest literature. Right now, Anjali Narlekar, she is a professor at the South Asian Literatures at the Rogers University, and her publication of the work, which is Bombay Modern, specifically looks at the translation and work literary writer. Right now, she specifically looks at the 1960s Bombay writers and how they, to a great extent, challenged and reformatted and reframed the scope and relevance of the poets of India post independence. Right. So much of her writings will look at translation studies, it'll look at Dalit writings, it'll look at feminist discourse, and definitely also protest literature. Right. Now, we will, of course, look at the origination of the Little Magazine. Now, the Little Magazine essentially is a writing form, it's a literary form that takes its origination in 1880s in America and England, right? Now, this is a form of writing that actively challenges and protests against mainstream modes of publication, which to a great extent was defined by very a consumerist capitalist mode of the consumption of literature, right? And because of this consumption of literature, to a great extent, it relegates the voices of the marginalized, ideas and opinions that are seen as anti-authoritarian or anti-government, right? So the little magazine in one sense becomes a form of writing that allows for resistance and protest, right? So like I had mentioned, it starts in the 1880s in England and America, and it spreads much later on to various other corners of the world. And eventually it reaches India in the 1960s, specifically in Mumbai. And from Mumbai, it later on grows as a literary tradition to Kolkata, Delhi, etc. And even today, it is an important mode of literary publication, but it is not so well known because, like I had mentioned, it is not capitalist in its nature. And because it's not capitalist in its nature, it rarely will become part of the mainstream culture or the popular culture. Rather, it is usually concentrated in a very niche, small group of like minded people. Right. So the name signifies most of all a non commercial. So when you're asked the question, what is a little magazine or what is the significance of it? These are few points that you need to highlight. Right. So one is that it is non commercial. Right now, it's very difficult to define what a little magazine is, because when you define something, you limit its scope, you limit its identity, and that is why you have a lot of writers that refuse to give a definition to what is a little magazine, right? But there are certain commonalities or similarities that we can see, and one is its non-commercial manner, right? Now, much of the writings that were published within the little magazine, it was written not for the sake of gaining financial or monetary success, but rather to allow for discussions, allow for resistance, representation, to be celebrated within the publication, right? And again, the manner of both editing, publication and managing all of it was in a very non-commercial manner, right? So you had a group of like-minded writers, editors, people that and readers that would come together in order to celebrate art, in order to celebrate literature, to celebrate voices of from marginalized spaces such as women, Dalits, Adivasis, etc. Right? So it was purely for the sake of putting forth one's opinions and ideas across, and contesting against a mainstream culture that to a great extent had commoditized literature. right? So the little magazine, again, it usually begins with the object of publishing literary work of some artistic merit that is unacceptable, right? So there are three reasons as to why the little magazine is important in the literary tradition. So these are the three that you need to keep in mind. One is that it predominantly publishes the works of unknown, unpopular writers and poets. Now, of course, in a very commercial capitalist world, only the writers that have some form of monetary, significance will get their work published, and because of which you have many writers that go underrepresented, that sadly will have to give up their dreams of publication. But the little magazine essentially gave opportunities to various such writers, writers from marginalized groups, oppressed groups, writers that predominantly wrote in regional languages, not in Hindi or in English, but in Marathi, in Malayalam, in Tamil, in various other languages that were not part of the mainstream consumption of the text. Right? You had writers that were amateurs that had never written before, so unpublished writers were also included in the form of publication. Right? Then the other reason as to the prominence of the little magazine were usually it will um, deal with ideas or opinions that are quite controversial and scandalous in nature, right? So unconventional form of art, of writing. So again, with the little magazine, much of its writings were very modernist and avant-garde in its take, right? Which meant that writings were extremely experimental, unconventional, unpopular in nature. So you had poetry that was challenged, refurbished in accordance to the will of the poet. It didn't suit the typical traditional normative standard of what a poem should be. Similarly, you had essays and writings and artwork that challenged the mainstream normative scope of what the art could be. Right, so you had a very avant-garde modernist take on writings that were also published. Similarly, and most importantly, the reason why the little magazine is an important source of literary tradition is that you had writings that were anti-authoritarian, anti-government, anti-caste, anti-gender, anti-various social rituals, regimes, traditions, etc. So essentially, it was a form of writing that spoke truth to power, right? Where spaces of marginality were explored within the tradition of the little magazine. So you had, this was again a time, especially in the 1960s, where not just Bombay, across India, you had various conflicts that were rooted along the basis of class, caste, gender, language, religion, etc. And the little magazine goes on to represent these conflicts, and that's a very important tool of both dissent, challenge, and discussion. Right? So these were the three reasons as to the prominence of the little magazine as a tradition and why is it important in today's society. Right? So there are few writers that have few historians, writers, critiques that have attempted to define the tradition of the little magazine. One is the historian, Gyan, and there's also Vilas Sarang, all of them who look at how the tradition of the little magazine it begins in Mumbai, right? And from Mumbai it goes on to inspire various other spaces. Now, the reason why Mumbai becomes, in one sense, a center point for this tradition of protest literature is predominantly because Mumbai, in one sense, becomes the microcosmic representation of India as a whole. Right now, India, especially post the 1960s, post the post-colonial nation, right? It is one that is grappling with a new sense of identity, right? A new globalized, liberalized identity. Similarly, it is also dealing with the challenges of religion, the challenges of caste, of gender, of class, right? This is again the time where you have various unionized groups, especially the mill workers that had gone for protest. 1960s, again, Mumbai, you had the establishment of the Shiv Sena that was promoting a monolingual space, a monolingual, mono-religious space. So you have a lot of such contesting voices, values that are put forth. And so Mumbai, in one sense, becomes representative of the nation as a whole. So you had a group of writers, very active, voracious readers that came together, discuss literature, art, the significance of art, and how it can change society, how it can mold society. Right. So you had, for example, Ezekiel, you had Arun Kolatkar, you had Adil Jaswala, all of them. Again, these are just to name a few, right? So all of them came together. They had active discussions every evening, and through this, they decided that poetry can become a source of empowerment, a source of information, and change in society. So much of their writings were published in these little magazines, right? And these little magazines, like I had mentioned, it was not for the larger consumption of the literary group, but it usually was circulated amongst very small groups, right?